Where I came from, I thought that we were, and I still believe that at the bottom of my heart, a relational people.
We have the right to self-government, to self-determination of land. And the people that are here are going to go back and continue to struggle. This is not an end, it's only a beginning.
Possibly could. The fact is that to think that there is a segment of our population, the youngest and the fastest growing, that is living a quality of life substantially less, receiving less funding for education, for healthcare, for welfare, that's just wrong. It's morally wrong.
I'm in Metis, as far as I know my Metis family, we live off the land.
We'd like to see in the Accord the two following principles. The principle that there must be recognition of a land base for the Aboriginal peoples.
And who believes that every person of Native ancestry, from whatever Indian stock and from whatever corner of this great country, has a special place in the Constitution in Section 35.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the channel. Thanks for tuning in. Just wanted to come and make a video for you today recapping our podcast where we went over the end of Métis identity politics. Is it true? Is it possible? I just wanted to make a video for you today to kind of condense a little bit of what we talked about on the podcast. Still hope you'll tune into the podcast, but let's give a go. I'll give you a little bit of information to read over with me as we go. Reviewing again the December newsletter that kind of encapsulates the MNC's General Assembly meeting, its dealings with the Métis Nation of Ontario, the suspension of the historic Métis communities there. So let's have a little bit of read through some of that December newsletter so we can add some context to the conversation. So in the newsletter it says that the Métis lawyer Jason Madden and the MMF Chief of Staff Al, in a discussion of what has been achieved at the Section 35 rights table with Canada, what remains to be done, and what is the time frame for concluding the self-government agreements. President Chartier joined the group in a discussion of the federal government's proposed Indigenous rights framework and the potential legislation. The Métis Nation supports the federal initiative in order to legally protect Section 35 rights resolution process, which presently are policy-based. So what does that really mean? Well, it means that in the background, what's going on is the Métis Nation National Council is in negotiations with the federal government to create a framework, what they call the Indigenous rights framework, and that is going to be the framework by which nations access Section 35 rights. So First Nations, Inuit, and Métis Nation will access Section 35 rights. That's really what this is the setup for, is the conversation that only nations, not people, nations have access to Section 35 rights. Now, if you follow that up with me, we'll go through the President's letter and go through the whole thing in its entirety, and then we'll talk about some of the points that reiterate the fact of why this whole Métis identity shift has occurred and what that might mean for the future. So if you have your copy, grab it, and if not, we'll post in this video. We'll have a quick read through, and then some things I think will become very clear of where things are going to go in 2019. So let's grab your message from the President bulletin, and let's have a quick read. It says, every people or nation at least should have a place to call home. The case of the Métis Nation, a distinct, newly emergent Indigenous people living primarily in what now is in Western Canada. So quickly, the Métis Nation, and primarily, not exclusively, living in Western Canada. With the recent decision by the majority of the members of the Métis National General Assembly to adopt a homeland map, which gives a general sense of the traditional territory of the Métis Nation, a lot of controversy has been engendered. There are some who say the boundaries do not extend far enough into British Columbia and Ontario. There are others who say it extends too far into British Columbia and the Northwest Territories. Others say it should reflect a decision by the courts, and in particular the Supreme Court of Canada's 2003 Powley decision, wherein it asserts the Sault Ste. Marie, Ontario, and envisions its Section 35 Métis rights-bearing community. And therefore, the area should be accepted as part of the historic Métis Nation homeland. The question, should the Métis Nation accept this? And then it goes on, what about the Alberta Court of Appeal, which in 2013, Southern Alberta was not part of the Métis homeland prior to the date of effective control, which they placed at 1874. And in particular, that prior to 1870, Southern Alberta was not at that time part of the traditional Métis territory. Does this mean that Southern Alberta should not be included in the Métis homeland map? I'm sure the Blackfoot Confederacy would support this position. So again, as we discussed in a previous video, the setup to this is the discussion of what makes the Métis homeland, where's the Métis homeland, what's the criteria and time frame from establishing the Métis Nation homeland, and if they accept the Powley that it includes Sault Ste. Marie, do they then have to accept the Alberta court decision which excludes Southern Alberta? That's the question, you know. So let's keep going. A further question is, what year or time frame should be adopted to demarcate the traditional territory of the Métis Nation homeland? Due to the highly mobile nature of the Métis, the date selected could have a significant impact on the geographic reach of the Métis homeland. While it may take more research to accurately demarcate the boundaries of the Métis Nation, enough research, publication, studies, and common sense have enabled the current decision to be made. Previous maps which showed the economic history of the Métis Nation Cart Trail Script Commission have been instructive and have helped inform the foundation of the geographic extent of the Métis Nation's territory. It should be kept in mind that the legal concept of Aboriginal title affirmed in Section 35 has a different set of requirements for proving such rights that are contained in the Supreme Court of Canada's Powley criteria for establishing Aboriginal harvesting rights. The proof for establishing Aboriginal title to lands and resources more onerous than establishing harvesting rights. Why all of a sudden the big distinguishing between Aboriginal harvesting rights and Aboriginal title? That is because of the Aboriginal Indigenous rights framework that is being hammered out behind closed doors for Section 35. I firmly believe this is a direct result of the Daniels case, which includes Métis people as Indigenous for the purpose of programs and services. If Indigenous people have access to Section 35 rights, the federal government is concerned that some 600,000 Métis people across Canada will then be entitled to Section 35 rights because they're Indian. And so what they want to do, again, the government wants to reduce its fiduciary responsibility to Métis people. And so to do this, the Métis National Council has been working to create this framework to limit Section 35 rights to nations, this conversation of nation. And then they want to reduce things like harvesting. They want to reduce things like programs and services to an Aboriginal title, but not the same title as a nation is entitled to under Section 35. Let's keep reading. So this leads to a major question of whether the homeland map should only include part of Western Canada where the Métis Aboriginal title can be established, or in the past was recognized. That geographic area in the late 1800s and early 1900s was covered by the Manitoba Act in 1870, the Land Provision and the Dominion Lands Act, and subsequent Script Commission, and current Northwest Ontario, where Métis adhered to Treaty 3 in 1875. in determining as close as possible the traditional homeland of the Métis Nation based on sound historical basis, the mobility of the citizens of the Métis Nation must be taken into account, and particularly the continued movement of the Métis following the 1870 to 73 reign of terror at the Manitoba Red River, the further dispersal after 1885, the resistance and the forced movement caused by the displacement from lands and resources, and the need to find sources of employment to feed our families. The mobility is evident today in Western Canada, where the Métis are still the people who moved the most. So the days of becoming refugees in our homeland still has its effects. In this connection, there are now large numbers of our citizens who have moved away from our homelands and to surrounding areas, in the particular the British Columbia, Northwest Territories, and Ontario. Clearly, there continues to be a need or a requirement that our citizens continue to be included in the social, economic, cultural, legal, and political life of the Métis Nation, its government. This must and can be accommodated, but does not change the historical existence of the Métis Nation, and where our right of self-determination and Section 35 rights are grounded. So there you go. That is the letter in its entirety. So what does this really mean? It means exactly that the 6 historic Métis communities in Ontario, when Sault Ste. Marie, where Powley was, are no longer considered valid criteria for, establishing historic Métis communities. So, if Sault Ste. Marie is no longer a historic Métis community by definition of Powley, that means that they can also lay claim to Southern Alberta because the Alberta Court doesn't have the ability to exclude Southern Alberta as Métis territory for Métis people settled there later. So the question is, they're hemming and hawing about the date they want to use for their map because, A, if they pull the date back a bit, they can exclude historic communities in Ontario. And if they extend the date forward a little bit past the signing of the treaties in Alberta, and specifically Southern Alberta, then they can include that territory. And so what this is a move that the Métis National Council has said that they no longer have jurisdiction over the term Métis. This is about Métis Nation. And if you'll see over the past months, and I think you'll see significant increase in this conversation in the upcoming months, the Métis National Council is going to continue to use this criteria for saying that they are a nation because of the flag, which they've trademarked, the term the Métis Nation, which they've trademarked, for the propagation of fighting for inclusion into this Indigenous rights framework for Section 35. What does this mean for everybody else? It means your Métis identity is no longer a question. They don't care. If you are an Indigenous person who qualifies for Powley and you get harvesting rights, they're saying that's fine. That's not really what they're about anymore. They're about their nation and the Métis Nation. And the Métis Nation has those rights. It has harvesting rights, and now is trying to get inclusion into Section 35. So for you and I, who may not be Métis Nation citizens, and you may be Métis from the Great Lakes, you may be Métis from Ontario, other parts, Quebec, the Maritimes, the Supreme Court of Canada, in the Daniels decision, recognizes your Aboriginal title. And so that's not the argument anymore. The Métis National Council acknowledges in this letter and in their statement and in their suspension of the Métis Nation of Ontario that people of mixed ancestry in the East are entitled to Aboriginal title. They're going to have it. When these 6 communities are essentially cut out of the Métis Nation of Ontario, they'll be independently Powley rights-bearing Métis people. The conversation will move from being rights-bearing Métis and authentically Métis to being not a nation, of course, and not entitled to Section 35. That's the discussion moving forward. But as of today, your identity as a Métis person is valid. The Métis National Council is not going to be continuing to talk anymore about mixed blood people in the East calling themselves Métis who are entitled to rights. That's not the conversation. They don't care. They've already said there's 6 communities with no historic connection to the Métis Nation. They've already said in this letter, as we've read, those historic communities are rights-bearing, they have historical connection, and are proven to pass Pauli. There you go. Your identity is clear, and it's valid, and it's affirmed by not only the government, but now the Métis National Council. So, what a Christmas gift moving into the 2019 season. We can all rest easy. We just have to ride out the wave of, our favorite professors running around trying to sell the last of their books and enduring, that little bit of lag that will continue. But as we move through 2019, I'm confident that the conversation is going to shift, and we're going to be able to have a very different conversation about the validity of Métis identity, but only as it pertains to establishing our historic communities for the purpose of getting more and more of those communities to pass the Pauli and affirm their historical connection, and of course tackle the government. But as far as this infighting of Métis identity, largely it's over. For all you who've put in the long hours on social media and taken the beating and been called fakers and self-indigenizing, race-shifting people from the East, the reality is that's no longer a conversation. Are there fakers out there? Sure, there's fakers in Alberta where I live. There's people who self-indigenize all the time, always have, always will, and will continue to fight that fight as we go. But the reality is, as far as Métis people, we have 6 historic Métis communities in Ontario already, right up to the Quebec border. And it will only be a matter of time as we continue through the upcoming years that this will continue to be more and more communities proven and become factual. And so, kudos to everybody. Take a deep breath, have a pause, celebrate your family, celebrate this great victory for Métis people and the war on Eastern Métis identity, because it's over. It is, as far as I can see, they have established quite firmly there are rights-bearing Métis people outside of the Métis Nation homeland. So, hats off to all you who are on social media. Look forward to lots of positive posts, lots of positive feedback, lots of positive discussion moving forward as we start to showcase our communities, talk about the great history and legacy of Great Lakes Métis and their Métis in Quebec and the Métis in the Maritimes. I look forward to seeing all kinds of great things coming forward as we can now celebrate our identity free from this conversation. So, I'm not sure I'll make another video before the holidays, so I hope you and yours have the best of the holiday season. I look forward to talking to you again in the new year, and until then, keep it real.